Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the NASDA Winter Policy Conference. I'm Barb Glenn, and I'm the CEO of NASDA, and I'm going to introduce this breakout session. So today, you're attending the session entitled Infrastructure, Bringing Rural America Up to Speed. According to USDA's Economic Research Service, rural Americans trail their metropolitan counterparts across a range of key indicators, and that includes income, employment growth, and labor force participation. Closing the rural opportunity gap will take efficient policy coordination, and it's going to take hard work, and we all want to do that. And COVID-19 has simply exacerbated those needs. To truly build opportunity in agricultural and our rural communities, we must be together at the table. It is imperative we take the necessary steps to keep farmers and ranchers in business. Today, this diverse panel of experts will discuss the new opportunities they see in Congress, the agencies, and through public-private partnerships to ensure that rural America does not get left behind. So with that, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our moderator. Robbie Boone is Senior Vice President and General Counsel at the Farm Credit Council, which is the National Trade Association for Farm Credit, a dedicated credit provider serving rural communities and agriculture. Among his duties, Mr. Boone deftly manages Farm Credit's coordinating role with the more than 260 national, state, and local partner organizations that comprise the Rebuild Rural Coalition, a rural infrastructure coalition highlighting the unique needs of rural communities, producers, businesses, and families since 2017. Before joining the council in 2009, Robbie served on Capitol Hill for 5.5 years in a legislative capacity for a member on both the Senate and House sides. Prior to that, he was an assistant vice president and analyst for U.S. Trust. Robbie received his BA in History and Communications with honors from the Wake Forest University. And Mr. Boone also holds a JD and an MBA from the University of Miami in Florida. Indeed, he's admitted to practice in North Carolina, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Supreme Court. And not to be left out, Robbie and his wife, Sarah, and their 3 children live very close by in Washington, D.C. So with that, welcome to everyone, and I'll turn it over to you, Robbie.
Well, Barb, thank you so much for that kind and very generous introduction. It is an honor to be with you, with NASDA, to talk about infrastructure. We have a terrific panel here today for you all, hopefully engaging, and we're going to mix things up a lot here, and just there is so much happening across the infrastructure landscape. I thought what I would do is go through, as Barb mentioned, Farm Credit is honored to coordinate the Rebuild Rural Coalition. And I thought before I introduce my esteemed colleagues, I'd run through a brief slide deck on Rebuild Rural. If we can pull those slides up, fantastic. And maybe we can just go straight to the next slide here. Just a brief background, as Barb indicated, we've had Farm Credit started coordinating this in 2017. We have 260 national, state, and local organizations all over the country. And the premise was, if you think back, way back, 2016, the presidential election campaign, then Secretary Clinton, then candidate Trump were both talking about the importance of renewed infrastructure investment. We thought that was terrific, but we also recognized that there was a dearth and needed to be a focus on rural infrastructure. It's not that urban infrastructure needs are not important. As I sit here in my basement in Washington, D.C., we've got to have it wherever we live. However, for rural communities, there are a lot of needs that are unique and that we really need to focus on. And so from that, in sort of the early days of 2016, we started the coalition in 2017. It's amazing that 4+ years later, from a Washington standpoint, the coalition is alive and well. Next slide, if we could. The coalition is organized broadly around these categories, and it's really neat today. You're going to be hearing, particularly, we'll have an opportunity to focus particularly on ag research, broadband, transportation, a little bit of healthcare from our panelists. You know, you could argue certainly that there are other areas that are important here, but generally speaking, for our Rebuild Rural Coalition partners, these 8 buckets, if you will, have been well understood as priorities for the coalition. Next slide. In terms of what's been going on in terms of coalition activities, we've really tried to organize ourselves around meetings with policymakers on House or Senate. Certainly with the current administration, we just sent a letter to President Biden that was co-signed by over 220 of our coalition partners. We've already gotten positive feedback from the current administration, and we're really excited. We're going to have a coalition briefing with the White House and also APLU, which we'll get a chance to talk about later. And then, you know, frankly, I've just been doing, calling a lot of attention to the rural infrastructure issues that have been out there. You know, much like for rural communities, it doesn't matter if you've got a D or an R behind your name. If there are infrastructure issues that are involved in your local communities, we want to hear from you and we want to hear what you have to say. So we've been really pleased about the bipartisan level of engagement. Next slide. We've had a lot of social media activities. We certainly appreciate NASDA's robust involvement, certainly on just using our hashtag Rebuild Rural, engaging with members of Congress when they're involved in rural infrastructure issues. Next slide. And then, you know, in terms of what we're expecting, and we'll have a chance during the discussion to get into this, lots of opportunity here for infrastructure. As you all know, certainly after we get through the reconciliation, the COVID stimulus process, certainly strong signals coming out of Capitol Hill and the administration that infrastructure is next on the table. You could sort of chuckle to yourself about, here comes another infrastructure week. We're certainly expecting that, but hopefully a real opportunity on an issue like infrastructure to really galvanize both parties here to get something done. Next slide. And you know, I guess to wrap things up as we head into introductions, when you think about infrastructure and Max, we'll talk about in a few minutes with National Grain and Feed, certainly surface transportation, people think about that. That's certainly issues that we all care about, but certainly things related to broadband, with rural health care, with housing. You can see just the sheer number of committees that could be involved in an infrastructure package is enormous. So we're expecting lots of potential activity and movement on Capitol Hill. Next slide. Perfect. So with that, let me segue to the most important part here and introduce our panelists. And I'm going to go in order of their presentations. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Doug Steele. He's Vice President for Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resources for the Association of Public and Landgrant Universities. Dr. Steele was appointed to his current position in January of 2019. Through collaborative partnerships, he focuses on broad cross-cutting issues related to agriculture, food and fiber, forestry, human sciences, natural resources. He's also APLU through the board on agricultural assembly, advocates yearly on behalf of agricultural research, extension, and education funding. He has extensive prior experience. He's held positions at Texas A&M, Colorado State, Montana State, Purdue University. He's at the national level. He's been extremely active, particularly in the National 4-H Council. He's former chairman of the board of directors, a trustee, as well as won numerous awards, and is not too far away from geographically from where our family lives. He's in Bowie, Maryland, with his wife, Lori, and they have 4 grown children and 1 grandchild. So welcome, Doug Steele. And then I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other 2 panelists. Max Fisher is Vice President of Economics and Government Relation at National Grain and Feed Association. Max joined NGFA in 2013 after serving as the Chief Economist for the Senate Agriculture Committee, which he worked for Senator Pat Roberts from Kansas. He received his undergraduate degree in agricultural business from Kansas State University and has a master's degree in agricultural economics from Texas A&M University. So welcome to Max, who, by the way, does a great job coordinating agricultural transportation working group along with the American Farm Bureau Federation. And finally, a pleasure of introducing Matt Wollum, who leads state government affairs for Land O'Lakes, a farmer-owned cooperative that does business in all 50 states. Matt has over 20 years of experience working on state and federal policy. Prior to his service with Land O'Lakes, he served 7.5 years within the executive leadership team at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as Assistant Commissioner for Agriculture and was later promoted to Deputy Commissioner of Agriculture. He's held multiple positions on Capitol Hill and also in the Minnesota Senate, and should say in the House and the Senate in Washington as well. He's also, since 2003, has been the 5th generation owner and operator of his family's farming operation in southwestern Minnesota, where he grows corn and soybeans. So with that, I just think you all are in for a great treat here. And Doug, I may turn things over to you for your introductory or opening remarks, I should say.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and maybe good morning to some of you. I want to first off congratulate Dr. Glenn, the NASDA leadership of the Planning Committee for moving to a virtual winter board meeting. Many of us have had that experience right now, and it's no small feat to get this done. And participation in these sessions have been tremendous, and thank you, Barb, for your leadership. You know, I think we're all here together, and I'm honored to serve on this panel talking about an issue that's very critical and important to all of us, and that is our rural communities, which are supported by rural infrastructure. And I have a mindset that we need to be on just trying to help these rural communities survive and put them in a position to thrive, to recognize their contributions to the United States, to our economy, and especially to the food production services that we all require. The Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities is a system of 244 public and land-grant universities, of which almost 100 of them are colleges of agriculture. In your traditional 1862 universities, our 1890 historically Black colleges and universities, our 1994 tribal colleges and universities, and our Hispanic serving institutions. We also have a series of non-land grant colleges of agriculture that are also part of our association, virtually having a footprint across the whole country. And obviously our partnership in many of our states with our state departments of agriculture is critical in our collaborations for success. Next slide, please. So let's talk about a situation that we probably already know exists, an aging infrastructure. And many of us can relate to this when you try to keep buildings and mortar, bricks and mortar put together, but how does this relate to our colleges of agriculture and our ag research infrastructure? We are challenged right now that almost 37% of our square foot capacity is over 50 years old. We are reaching a critical point in time in our history of ag infrastructure research. It's not possible to repair anymore. We're really talking about tear down and rebuilding, especially to meet the critical needs we have now in looking at the climate research, soil health, and many of the areas we're called on to respond to needs across the world that we're facing today. And so we need to understand that this will not get better, it will only get worse, and we can no longer afford to stop putting off these investments in a rural infrastructure package for ag research. Next. So this is no surprise to anybody. In 2015, APLU conducted a study with a infrastructure group called Sightline, and that report said, if you looked at all the infrastructure at our land-grant universities, we have about an $8.4 billion deficiency in deferred maintenance. Well, over the last 5 years, we refreshed that study last September, and that 8.4 billion has now grown into 11.5 billion. And the cost to replace that square footage also is rising at the same time. So we have a eroding ag infrastructure. We have an immediate investment to also renew and replace in many cases. And investments in capital infrastructure across our colleges and schools will have incredible impacts for our ag producers, ag community. Next. So why invest in ag research? Our ag economists tell us that for every $10 to $20 invested in ag research, for every $1 invested in ag research, we see a benefit of $10 to $20. Investing in food and ag research will increase our sustainability and productivity over time. Our current level of spending for ag researchers and extension programs are at the same level that we had in 1980. So in real dollars, we have lost capacity over time. Ag infrastructure and research is an investment that benefits farms of all sizes, all commodity groups, all of our communities, and helps stimulate that local economy and global economic growth. And maybe one of the main factors we need to be aware of in 2016 alone, China has now outspent the United States in agricultural investment by nearly $3 billion. In fact, we are no longer even in the top 5 in ag research R&D in the world anymore. Next, please. So what can we do about it? Well, we've got to cultivate this new air for ag research to address the many concerns that are brought before us in our communities. A strategic investment in ag research will help us catch up with our deferred maintenance costs and help us prepare also for the future. So currently the infrastructure is supporting current activities, but as we see every day, there are more and more research needed in the agricultural sector to help us be more competitive. And we don't want to lose our standing as really the world leader in ag innovation. And many countries and their investments are putting us at risk of losing that. And the other good thing about when you talk about investment in our infrastructure is it can provide an estimated 20,000 jobs. This is the immediate construction jobs in rural communities. This does not include the jobs that can be added to our research portfolio with that investment. So with that, I just want to thank you for attending the session today. I want to express my appreciation to our State Departments of Agriculture. Your work with our Landgrant Universities are very important, and I know we have long-term collaborative partnerships that have yielded great results over the years, and I'm looking forward to the future together. Thank you, Robbie.
Yes, sir. Max.
Okay. Hey, I want to begin by thanking NASDA for letting me take part in your conference. I'm sure there was some hesitation to go forward with the virtual format, but I'm glad you did, and it appears like you're being rewarded with record attendance. So job well done. Appears like the conference is going great, and I am going to share some information on agricultural transportation, specifically some federal policies that could be enacted to help it make it a little more efficient. Next slide, please. So we all know that before you grow an agricultural commodity, you need to have a market for it. But often we don't think about, you also need to have efficient, cost-efficient transportation to get that commodity to market. If your market is, let's say, Japan, and you're growing a specialty soybean, you better make sure that you have a way not just to truck it to your handler, but also for the handler to efficiently get that product to Japan. Currently, many of you know about the issues that are going on at the ports with respect to getting export containers and what that's done. Anyway, that's really disrupted the whole supply chain all the way from the end user overseas to the ports, to the handlers that are inland, and probably to the producer for the upcoming growing season. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, the first mode, is water transportation. In 2020, the Water Resource Development Act was passed, and it did a great thing in getting additional resources to maintain the locks and dams. It changed the cost share formula from a 50-50 split to a 65-35 split, federal to private. That's going to get more money to help maintain these locks and dams. As a lot of you know, they're beyond their design lifespan. Anytime there's major disruption, it can essentially take away a market for farmers to be able to sell onto the river, and it leaves them with the inland prices instead of also having the export prices. So on the second bullet, you're going to see the upper Mississippi, Illinois waterways. The reason I put that on there is that's something that a lot of ag groups in DC have been trying to get Congress to appropriate funds for a good number of years now, probably close to 10. There's about 1,200 foot locks that we would like to see installed on the upper Mississippi, Illinois waterways. Right now, there's just the 600 foot locks that are on the, anyway, I guess to give you an analogy, it's kind of like having an old grain truck and we want to update to have the newer, bigger semi with the 1,000 bushel trailer. So anyway, that's what we're trying to get done. We keep making baby steps, but I think we're getting closer. Next slide, please. And I thought I'd work in just kind of what the private sector is doing too. This is just one small example. The National Grain and Feed Digital Solutions, that's part of my association, a little offshoot of it. Believe it or not, all of the barges as they went up and down the river, more down than up, oftentimes the owners changed several times as that barge is going down. And they were doing it, and the part I want to say, believe it or not, was they were using paper bills of lading each time that ownership changed. So it might change 7 times as it goes down the river system. And they were having to essentially pass title through these bills of lading. So anyway, so this last year they created National Grain and Feed Digital Solutions is what we're calling it, created an electronic format to be able to keep track of that chain of custody as the barge commodities go down the river system. So anyway, it's just a good example of how we're moving in to the future and using technology to help us out. Next slide, please. On truck transportation, this is the big one. Almost every ag commodity, as you know, is trucked at some point or another in its life, usually the first step. So anyway, these are all incremental steps that can be taken to make it a little more efficient. Our goal is to increase truck capacity. It's not just our goal at National Grain and Feed. There's many other ag associations who are working on this. We kind of join together whenever we can to try to get across the finish line. Some ways that we're joining together is we're trying to make it to where the ag exemption to the hours of service rules, because when you need to get to the market, you got to get to the market. So as you know, during harvest, you need extra hours. So the ag exemption allows haulers to, as long as they're within 150 air mile radius of the origin of the product, to essentially be able to put in extra hours getting their work done. So right now it varies by state. Some states are year round, others aren't. We're trying to make that nationwide so that haulers know no matter where they're at, they can have access to this exemption. And then there are a number of others down there due to the time constraint. I won't go through them all, but I will say I will point out that second one. During the coronavirus, Congress did allow for, I believe it's 120 days, they allowed states to decide what the weight limits would be on the interstate highways. Normally that weight limit is set at 80,000 pounds. But for 120 days, states had that authority to raise the weight limit. And for many states, they already have higher weight limits on their state roads. So they were able to harmonize the state road weight limits along with the federal interstate highway system weight limits. And you can imagine what that does for efficiency when you have the same weight limits on all roads. Let's go to the next slide. And then I will wrap up with rail transportation, which is a great thing. And I think as we really get into climate change, people are going to realize that, especially the water and the rail, great ways to move ag products, probably the most fuel efficient ways to do it. However, in rail transportation, we only have 7 major carriers in this country, and they're split out among the regions. And if you don't have access, like say, to the inland waterways as a shipper, then, well, let's just say that the railroads have a lot of pricing power over you. So some of the things that we've been working on are, I've got them bulleted out there so that you can see. These are just ways to give the shipper a way if they're experiencing higher rates than than what makes sense. And I use an analogy of passenger rail carriers where, it is possible that you could essentially price people out of the market. And, I don't think that might be best for Amtrak, let's just say, but, total welfare for society is not maximized if you price out, make it to where people can only get to work at say 8 and 5 and no service in between. So we just got to strike a balance when it comes to ag freight too, to make sure that total welfare is maximized, not just the welfare of the railroads. So I'll wrap up with that. And thanks again for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Max. Matt, over to you.
Well, thanks, Robbie, and thanks to NASDA for the invitation and for putting together this panel on this really important issue of infrastructure. I think it's a very timely discussion given what's going on in Washington and across the states, and just really appreciate NASDA's leadership on this, as well as your participation in various different efforts on these critical issues. As Robbie mentioned, I'm with Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes is a farmer-owned cooperative. We do business in all 50 states. And you may know us for our dairy business, but we also own Winfield United, which is our crop input business. So you think about those local farmer-owned elevators, ag retail outlets. They are member owners of Land O'Lakes as well. And then we own Purina Animal Nutrition. In all of this, we touch about 10,000 rural communities and work with about half of the cropland acres in the United States. So we understand this issue of the digital divide. And we've seen it. It's a critical piece for the foundation of rural communities. And we're looking forward to talking more about that today. Molly, next slide. In today's virtual environment, 14 million people across the United States, 11 million of which live in rural communities, do not have access to broadband infrastructure. And if you consider the number of folks that have unreliable or slow access, that number is even larger than that. So the fact is, in this COVID environment where many of us are working virtually, we have these virtual conferences and engagements and so forth, those families, businesses, and communities that are not connected are being left behind, as simply as that. And we need to address this issue. You look at the impacts that this has had in this COVID era. 16 million K-12 students across the country, 400,000 teachers lack reliable access to broadband. We have 128 rural hospitals that have closed. We've got 450 that are at risk of closure. Telemedicine is absolutely critical for healthcare access in rural communities, yet 1 in 4 households have been unable to get medical care during this COVID pandemic. And of that, 50% have indicated that someone in their family has had a negative health consequence as a result. And you look at this economically, about between July of 2018 and July of 2019, only 8% of new jobs were placed in rural communities. And that's an economic driver for us as we move forward. And on top of that, median incomes are about $15,000 lower in rural communities than our urban counterparts. So critical issues that we need to address. Next slide, Molly. Thriving rural and vital rural communities are really a foundation for all of us. And I know we certainly in the NASDA community understand that. And it's also critical for a safe and stable, affordable food supply as a pillar of our national security. And while we operate in this global environment, the communities and businesses and and families that live and work in rural communities need to be able to access technology to compete in this global world that we live in. And broadband is really the how we enable this thriving, vital rural community. Next slide, Molly. As you can see here, it's more than just agriculture. Rural broadband is a multiplier that unlocks human and economic capital. Everything from economic growth to job creation, telehealth and mental health, being able to provide those services in rural communities to enhance productivity on the farm. You look at, and just in our farmer-owned cooperative through Winfield United, we have a tremendous data silo that has tools to help our farmers make better, more productive decisions on the land. And using technology to address issues around water quality and climate are critical. Distance learning, workforce development, it goes on and on. The value of broadband really helps to elevate all of these areas and make these, which I would argue are critical services in those rural communities, is what makes them vital. Next slide. So earlier this year, we, through our cooperative network, as well as with partners all across the country, and through a coalition that I'm going to share with you a little bit more about, we recognized that broadband infrastructure in these rural communities was going to be a major gap when we consider the impacts of COVID. And so we immediately recognized that we're not going to be able to build out this infrastructure immediately. We needed to find a short-term solution to be able to offer to families and communities in which we live, work, and operate. And so we stood up over 2,800 free public Wi-Fi locations where families could come, pull up in their car, maintain social distancing, but be able to access guest Wi-Fi to do their telehealth appointment, to do their distance learning, or to access business needs that they had. We have covered this in 49 states. You can see the map. The use case has been tremendous. We're seeing, in some of our Land O'Lakes owned locations, we're seeing anywhere from 20 to 30 people a day coming, for 60 to 90 minutes at a time to access this critical service. Next slide, Molly. We have also assembled a coalition of 144 major partners and trade associations to advocate for critical resources to close the digital divide. You can see some of the logos here. They include ag and food companies, healthcare, technology, education entities, nonprofits, and others. Several of the other panelists are also part of the American Connection Project work, and we certainly thank them, as well as NASDA. NASDA was an early sign-on and partner to this effort, and so we deeply appreciate your participation. What are we advocating for? We're advocating, we know that closing the digital divide is an $80 to $150 billion problem. We're advocating for at least an investment of $80 billion to close this. We recognize that may need to be distributed in a number of different ways through various different programs. We're being technology agnostic in terms of what investments we're making. We also know that we need to have strong coordination. There are several federal agencies that have a role in broadband deployment. We need to make sure that they're coordinated, that there's a strategy, and that they're also coordinating with the states. The states have programs as well, much of which you would know about in your individual states. And there needs to be strong coordination and the program and the strategy needs to be in sync. Finally, on the broadband side, mapping. Mapping is so critical. FCC has maps that are not granular and accurate enough. And so we need to make sure that we get those updated. We appreciate Congress passing $65 million in the COVID relief package in December to do just that. And then on telehealth, there's been waivers that were provided from the federal level. The states have made significant waivers and executive orders as well. We need to look and learn from those orders and what happened in the telehealth space, and how do we make some of those things permanent. Next slide. So I think, we're urging you as secretaries, directors, commissioners of ag, other partners of NASDA, join with us in this effort. It's going to take all of us. We need to, make our voices heard, make this a priority in every state house as well as in DC. This is the moment to close the digital divide, and we look forward to working with you on that effort, and certainly appreciate Barb and team, as well as the rest of the NASDA community for your strong support of broadband and these efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thanks to all the panelists who I should mention are Rebuild Rural Coalition members. And that's one of the great pleasures, including NASDA, being involved with a coalition like this. As you can tell, we just coordinate it, and it's amazing to have just the expertise that you all are getting to see a piece of today. Just to give you a little bit of the road ahead here, we've got some time now for Q&A. I think we're maybe 5 minutes or so behind at this point, but what we'd like to do is maybe have, we can certainly adjust that as Amanda and Molly suggest, but we've got an opportunity here for a little bit of Q&A with the panelists. And what I might do, Doug, is I may start with you. You were kind enough to suggest at the outset, I know Rebuild Rural's got now a briefing with the White House next Thursday at 11 a.m. And while that's going to start with the administration providing an update on their infrastructure plan going forward, the second half of that briefing is going to be on ag research, and APLU will be presenting on that. We thank Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau Federation, who continues to lead on that as well from a coalition standpoint. But I guess would turn to you in terms of just this is ag research extremely vital out there. What are things that NASDA's memberships can be doing? What's sort of the role that they can play to help elevate these type issues in their states?
Robbie, thank you for the question. And one thing that has really intrigued me as all the panelists spoke is that the value of having these coalitions to represent rural areas and amplify our voices. We all know there's a lot of thousands of small groups out there trying to work with rural communities and rural areas. And the more we can come together, I think the louder that voice becomes. And it's going to be necessary. These are big lifts. This is not easy work to do what we're talking about. And so it's going to take all of us working together. And I think, Robbie, that's what's unique about many of the partnerships between our state departments of agriculture and their land-grant universities. If you look at the mission and the mission crossover, most of our departments of agriculture are regulatory, they're policy generating, they're marketing, they provide producer assistance, and then it's complemented well by the land-grant university that has the outreach and engagement through extension that can help with certification programs, provide collaborative educational outreach with departments of ag, and then the ag research agenda is so critical for all of us. And I know when I was in Texas, one of the biggest ag agendas was what can we do to create these niche markets and additional crops that was identified through the State Departments of Agriculture. So I think moving forward, it's continued to strengthen those common areas we need to work together. Part of our strategy after the big public launch next week is to have our research directors reach out to their State Departments of Agriculture, make sure they understand what we're asking for, and really ask for their support, not just within the state government, but also on the federal level, as we really strive to make this a priority for ag research infrastructure.
Thanks, Doug. And Max, I may turn to you next. I mean, just as you all can tell, just NGFA has been a tireless advocate for surface transportation, inland waterways, rural roads and bridges. Frankly, barely a day goes by where Max is not reaching out on some issue that the agricultural working group, transportation working group is working on. So thank you for all your efforts. Max, are there things, I mean, in National Grain and Feed, certainly from the coalition standpoint, was with us at the very beginning. You're no stranger to infrastructure discussions on Capitol Hill, certainly from your perch in the Senate. What do you think, how should agriculture position itself to best benefit from a future infrastructure package?
Good question. And that's one we've been grappling with. We've had time to think about it too. That's the problem. We still don't have the answers. Last year we were supposed to have a surface transportation bill, and the can got kicked down the road a year. So here we are again in 2021, and we're going to have one. And last year the House highway bill definitely had a climate element to it, and I suspect that this one coming up will have just as much, probably more, of a climate element. And we in agriculture have to decide how to engage on that. Obviously a lot of us rely on ethanol, right, as a major part of agriculture now. And what's the future of ethanol, let's say, within the climate change? A lot of other things, farming practices are going to change, but within the bill, the House bill last year, it had a lot of charging stations, money for charging stations, to promote electrical vehicles, so on and so forth. And that's something that our ag groups need to come together and just decide. I don't have the answers, I guess, right now at this point, as to, when it comes to transportation, how to position ourselves on that. Obviously, we want to let the marketplace kind of decide how this all rolls out, and it's all good and well to encourage better climate practices, and ethanol, I think, is certainly part of that. And just want to make sure that as we go from potentially from internal combustion engines to electric motors, that it's not too hard and not too fast. And because you never know what the next innovation is going to be. Because I actually just saw where Porsche is coming out with a clean burning fuel that somehow or another, I don't know how they do it, but somehow or another they get the carbon out of it. So I guess I wouldn't stick a fork in carbon fuels, or or ethanol, which is a blending component of carbon fuels, because you just don't know what's coming down the pike. So I guess my advice is we just need to be at the table as Congress writes this next bill to see what proposals are being put forward, and hopefully provide some input.
Max, thank you. And before checking in with Amanda, I would like to check in with Matt. And Matt, your work at Land O'Lakes, I mean, frankly, having a star CEO that many of us around the country are familiar with, Beth Ford. I think right after she was hired, we've joked that she, not every CEO can get a 60 minutes interview willingly whenever they want. And the neat stuff that you all have done with the American Connectivity Project. And as you showed, I mean, just a very diverse group, including non-traditional sort of agricultural rural stakeholders. That really kudos to the work you all have done. Anything you'd like to sort of highlight in terms of what you all, as this new Congress is getting ramped up, some of the priorities that your coalition is going to be focused on?
Yeah, well, thanks, Robbie. And Beth has been a real advocate for rural communities, and made broadband, frankly, a strategic priority for our business, just because they're, the importance to the rural communities that we live, work, and operate. As we move forward, we see the same opportunities in terms of, there's COVID relief packages, there's the potential for an infrastructure package to come together. This coalition that we put together is not only in the food and ag space, but we've tried to really cut a cross section of the economy because, we know that, for example, Mayo Clinic right here in Minnesota, they are a major innovator of healthcare devices and technology. They also own and operate a number of rural hospitals. And frankly, they're not able to use the same innovations that they have in those rural hospitals. They've also shared that, there's more telehealth appointments in one day now than what they did in all of 2020. So the point here is that the need is real. We're reaching out, we're having conversations with the White House, we're engaging with legislators on the Hill. We need to continue that drumbeat with the governors and state legislators across the country, and really look to NASDA to help with that and be engaged in that effort as well.
Well, Matt, thank you. And I guess, Amanda, it may turn things back over to you and your team, because I know that this is the portion where you may have some audience questions that have been, hopefully folks have had some time to think about some of these issues, as there's just a lot of good work to be done across the landscape here. So turn things back over to you all and see if there's some questions out there from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. I don't see any questions just yet. I'll certainly keep you updated.
We can carry on. I guess maybe a question for everyone here, all the panelists. Are there things, as you think about NASDA's membership and infrastructure, and Max made the great point about we need to work together. One of the things I know we've suggested at the Farm Credit Council in terms of an infrastructure bill is maybe it makes sense for a rural set aside of a certain percentage, call it 25% of any infrastructure package, just to give us something that's digestible in terms of something that Congress can work with. Are there specific things that, I know Doug, you had an opportunity to talk about this, but are there some specific things that NASDA's membership can be doing to further engage on some of these issues?
One thing I feel like is really important, and Dr. Glenn and I talk about this, is where do their priority areas fit with many of the topics we talked about today. This is not a one and done. This is not a one-time fix. This is going to take a sustained, long effort to do that. And many of our organizations, unfortunately, don't have long-term advocacy or priority agendas because there's so much impact every year and things change. So one is, I think we really need to give serious consideration about what that multi-year effort looks like. I also appreciate what you said, Robbie. I think we've got to look at protecting money that's dedicated to going to rural areas. We know across this country in the hallways of Congress, we don't have the kind of rural votes that we used to have. And so it can't become a rural versus urban. It's got to be where we mutually benefit from the work that each is doing. And we got to, I think, really bring that message forward to be important. And I think one of the other areas we need to really consider is, can we get all of our rural communities to speak with one voice? Because it's going to take the work of Congress, it's going to take the work of state government, it's going to take the work of county government. And when I look at the map that Matt put up there, it really brings to mind there's some huge areas that need help, huge areas that need assistance. And as I said earlier, having an amplified voice, working together and finding a common agenda with goals that we can work towards over our multi-year approach, I think that's the only way we're going to make it happen.
Dr. Steele, I want to echo exactly what you just said. I think that is so important, and making sure that we're not talking to just our friends, but also those that may not understand agriculture in rural communities. And how do how do we help them understand the value of what we're providing? You know, as I mentioned, you know, and we all know this, but those rural communities are foundational to our national security and a safe, affordable food supply. And frankly, you know, Dr. Steele's folks through the colleges and universities are helping to create the next innovations that are going to be critical to addressing some of the biggest challenges like climate change and water quality and those types of things. And you know, certainly Max's work through, you know, the Grain and Feed Association, how do you get you know, those commodities to market? So it's really important that we figure out a way to talk about this as how does this impact every single American? How does this impact urban and rural communities? And help folks understand how they can be part of that solution.
You make it. Go ahead, Max.
I was just going to add, and NASDA is probably the perfect conduit for these conversations, where you represent, you know, the whole country essentially, and it's, you know, by its nature, it's a bipartisan, you know, association. So anyway, you guys have a special place where you probably have a lot more, I guess, respect from both sides of the aisle. And both from rural and urban, because every state has ag and then it also has the urban. And you guys, anyway, I just think that NASDA is in a special place to be able to influence it, no matter which Congress is in place.
Absolutely. And, you know, Matt makes a great point about, and something we need to not forget, because when you think about infrastructure upgrades, whether you're urban or rural, it's a U.S. competitiveness issue. And when you think about what's going on in China, when you think about what's going on in Brazil, any observer or anyone who has been over there recently, and I know Max, to Matt's point, Max's organization would know this well, they're not standing still. They're making those necessary upgrades. And, you know, these are the type things we need to do to keep the U.S. competitive internationally. I'm curious just to, and I know Amanda will interrupt us if there's an audience question. Curious on the pandemic, what you all are seeing in COVID times. You know, we've heard so much about the rural-urban divide. Ironically, we've seen a lot of Americans who, as we've seen over time, folks have been moving out of rural communities for jobs or other things. Some of the things, frankly, from Rebuild Rural's perspective, we needed to upgrade anyway to make rural communities more competitive. We're seeing now almost a rebound effect out to rural communities now as folks have wanted to, frankly, escape more denser communities for sort of the freedom of rural communities. I'm curious, just from your respective organizations, how has COVID impacted sort of how you all think about infrastructure investments right now locally?
We're definitely a lot more reliant on Matthew's work. Your work with Land O'Lakes with the broadband. It was just a couple of weeks ago, I called a large member of NGFA, one that normally would have its headquarters in a major city. And I expected to be talking to somebody in a major city. And instead, to my surprise, the guy on the other end was actually talking to me from my hometown in Kansas, an itty bitty little town of 1,000 people. And I was like, how in the world is a guy who works for this major grain company working in this itty bitty little town? And he was the director of containers for this major. So he's the one, you know, buying freight that is, you know, sending containers from the inland to the ports. And anyway, he was able to do it even from this tiny little town in Kansas, you know, because of the technology, right? So anyway, yeah, we give a lot more credence to the power of technology today than we did a year ago.
Matt, Doug?
Go ahead. I would just say that, yes, I think for those rural communities that have access, you know, there may be families moving back in those areas. For those that don't, you know, there may be some temporary bump, but longer term, you know, those communities are you know, still at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, in the ag space, we hear quite a bit about, you know, families who are trying to transition the farm from one generation to the next. They have, you know, a son or daughter that's interested in coming back, but you know, they may have a spouse, and that spouse may be able to have a telecommuting kind of job, but they don't have access out at the farm, and so therefore, you know, that son or daughter isn't coming back for that transition, and so that's you know, things that we hear about, you know, at Land O'Lakes. And but I think, you know, long and short, you know, the biggest thing right now is around healthcare access. It's around, you know, being able to get the basic things done in life. You know, making sure that your kids can, you know, get on their Zoom class for you know, first grade. You know, those types of things are what are front of mind for a lot of people in rural communities today.
Doug, any comments from land grants in terms of COVID and just the impact you all been experiencing?
I think the biggest takeaway we have is we all know that our rural communities are pretty fragile in many areas. We knew there were some cracks in the infrastructure. We have now seen there's wide gaps. There's chisels in infrastructure. What Matt just said about the ability to have telehealth, have AP classes available for students, the transportation, if you're losing your elevators and you can't trade 24/7 a day like you need to be successful, the lack of broadband infrastructure. The pandemic has shown a bright light on a lot of the inequities between rural and urban areas and the lack of services between rural and urban areas. But I would like to just close by saying, I think if you take a defensive position and talk about a rural-urban divide, you put people on an edge. I think we need to talk about the rural-urban interface. How do we mutually benefit from the work that each other's doing? Because if you look at our strengths and build on common ground, that's a whole lot different model than trying to find out why we're different and how come we can't work together.
Well, thank you. And I guess we'll open, we've got probably time for one or two audience questions if there's anything, and I think you all are welcome to chat or pose a question. So if there's anything last minute, we certainly welcome that from folks. Molly, man, anything from the audience we need to cover before we head towards wrap up?
No, I think the audience is celebrating the panel, but no further questions coming through.
They're letting us off. Folks are letting us off easy here. Well, I guess by way of wrap up, I want to, again, on behalf of esteemed panelists, thank you to NASDA for including infrastructure on as part of your winter conference, and we just thank you for the opportunity that you've given us. Our plates are full on infrastructure. The needs, as Doug talked about, are multi-year. Certainly rebuild rural, certainly through Land O'Lakes connectivity project, coalition work, we believe works really well. So we appreciate the partnership out there, and the journey continues. So I want to express our thanks to NASDA for having us on the program, and I think we'll turn things back over to you all unless there's anything else we need to cover.
Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.